Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Lots of news tonight, even for a Monday. India has a China-sized problem and it's getting aggravated. Home Minister Amit Shah is in Arunachal Pradesh, days after China renamed 11 places in the state. The message is swift and clear. An angry Beijing says it threatens peace. It's a bit rich coming from China, especially now when it is encircling Taiwan and threatening war. Meanwhile, reports say that India may have put trade talks with the UK on hold. That's because India is angry with lack of action against the Khalistanis in London. New Delhi has issued a denial of sorts, but we'll look deeper into the deal, while London wants it, and what India's posture might convey. Also, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, wants to push for European autonomy. He doesn't want to follow America in fighting China. But is that an option? Also, is this a distraction from his domestic troubles? We'll discuss all of that and news of a footballer fighting the Turkish election alongside President Erdogan. That and more coming up. The headlines first. Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister in India defends New Delhi's decision to buy Russian oil, calls it pragmatic. She's also hailed Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership.
I think that India, as a global player, really is a Vishwaguru of the world.
The Philippines says it won't allow quote-unquote offensive actions by US troops from its bases. Last week, Manila gave the US 4 more military bases to use, bringing the total to 9. China says the move could endanger regional peace. China's Weibo mutes spammers for hijacking the trending topic Taiwan Strait drills. Weibo is Beijing's biggest microblogging site. It has removed hundreds of posts that carried the hashtag Eastern Theatre Command. North Korea cuts communication link with the South. Pyongyang denounces its neighbor as a quote-unquote puppet traitor for holding military drills with the US. A constitutional crisis is brewing in Pakistan. Finance Minister Ishaq Dar defies the Supreme Court opposing provincial elections. He says they're not in national interest due to the economic situation. The Supreme Court had asked the government to release more than $70 million to the election body. And the Dalai Lama says sorry for asking a minor boy to suck his tongue. The apology comes after a video shows the Tibetan spiritual leader kissing the boy's lips. The Dalai Lama's office says he apologizes for the hurt that his words may have caused. The India-China border issue is heating up. Last week, China renamed 11 places in India's Arunachal Pradesh. Today, India's Home Minister Amit Shah landed in the state. An angry China has issued a statement. It calls the visit a violation of China's sovereignty. But why is China so upset? Because India is responding to it in a language that it understands. In the past, India used to play down such tensions. It used to keep avenues for talks open, but China does not play by those rules. So this time, India is making some bold moves. The first provocation came from China. Last week, Beijing released new maps. It renamed 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh. It's an Indian state. The world recognizes it as an Indian state. But Beijing gave Chinese names to 11 places in the state. It kicked off a diplomatic storm. And remember, China is yet to de-escalate from Ladakh. That standoff is far from resolved. Thousands of troops from both India and China remain deployed at the border. And now Beijing has opened another front in Arunachal Pradesh. This is a clear provocation and India is responding with this. Home Minister Amit Shah is on a 2-day visit to the state. He's launching a new program to develop border villages. And he's highlighting China's expansionist agenda.
कोई भी हमारी सीमा पर आंख उठाकर देख नहीं सकता और आज हम गर्व के साथ कहते हैं वो जमाने चले गए जब भारत की भूमि का कोई अतिक्रमण कर सकता था आज 100 की सुई की नोक जितनी भूमि का भी अतिक्रमण कोई नहीं कर सकता क्योंकि आईटीबीपी और भारतीय सेना यहां पर उपस्थित है.
Obviously, China is upset. It has shot off a statement to New Delhi. Here's what China said about Home Minister Amit Shah's visit. Zhangnan is China's territory. The Indian officials' visit to Zhangnan violates China's territorial sovereignty and is not conducive to the peace and tranquility of the border situation.
Zhangnan is China's territory. The Indian officials' visit to Zhangnan violates China's territorial sovereignty and is not conducive to the peace and tranquility of the border situation. China firmly opposes this.
What is Zhangnan? It's China's name for Arunachal Pradesh. That's what they call it, Zhangnan or South Tibet. The Indian Home Minister will spend 2 days in the state. The idea is to send a message to China. It cannot go on with its salami slicing tactics. It cannot keep encroaching on Indian land and claiming it as its own. It cannot unilaterally change maps and expect the world to follow them. India is responding by strengthening its own defenses. The border has been tense for almost 3 years now. In this period, India has launched several new initiatives. And the Home Minister will highlight that. Today, he launched the Vibrant Villages program. This was in Kibitu. It's a remote village in Arunachal Pradesh, Kibitu. And why was Kibitu chosen for this? Again, to send a message to China. Remember the new map we told you about? The one where China has renamed 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh? One of those places is near Kibitu. And perhaps that is the reason why this village was chosen for today's event. India wants to convey that these areas remain an inalienable part of India. Now, what is the Vibrant Villages program? It's India's answer to China's Model Villages program. For years now, China has been building a chain of moderately prosperous villages. These are near the LAC, or the line of actual control, which is the de facto border between India and China. These model villages are on the Chinese side. Beijing likes to call them development projects. But essentially, they're bases for China to further its territorial claims. Experts say the Chinese military could use these villages. In the event of a conflict, they'll use this border infrastructure to mobilize men and military equipment. India's project is different, though. India is not an expansionist power. History is proof. India's rise has been peaceful. So this program, the Vibrant Villages program, is said to be a development and connectivity project. It is basically meant to integrate remote areas with the rest of India and improve the quality of life for those living there. Kibitu is just one project. There are almost 3,000 villages in 19 districts that will be developed through this program, 3,000 villages. And these villages will be on the northern borders of Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh and Ladakh. So the plan is basically to cover almost the entire line of actual control with China. In the first phase, 662 villages will be covered. This includes 455 villages in Arunachal Pradesh alone. And which are the focus areas? Again, I have a list. Road connectivity, drinking water, electricity, which includes renewable sources like solar and wind power, mobile and internet connectivity, tourist centers, multi-purpose centers, and healthcare infrastructure. India has allocated about $586 million for this project. And that's not all. Kibitu is getting 9 micro-hydel projects too. They will provide electricity to border villages. On this visit, Home Minister Amit Shah is also inaugurating security projects. These belong to the ITBP, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. It is India's first line of defense against China at the border, the ITBP. Earlier this year, New Delhi decided to bolster the ITBP. Close to 9,000 troops will be added to this force. A total of 7 battalions will be raised. And where will these troops be deployed? Reports say they will be sent to 47 new border posts and a dozen staging camps. These will be along the India-China border. So development of remote areas and security are covered. But India's response has a third aspect too, and that is connectivity. In recent years, India has ramped up connectivity projects, especially in Arunachal Pradesh. As of last year, there were 73 road construction projects in the works. This is border infrastructure for the state of Arunachal Pradesh. These roads will enable better access to the LAC, the line of actual control. In 5 years, India has spent around $1.8 billion on roads alone, $1.8 billion. And that's how India is approaching its China challenge, covering all bases and firming up defenses. The The only difference is this. Earlier, India preferred to work quietly while China played the wolf warrior. Beijing talks in a loud and confrontational tone and follows up with provocative actions on the border. Home Minister Amit Shah's visit to Arunachal Pradesh is a departure from the past for India. It no longer wants to stay silent. It is making its intentions clear and acting decisively as the dragon breathes fire. And speaking of India acting decisively, will the UK get a sample too? I ask this because a report has been making the rounds since yesterday. It says India is halting trade talks with the UK over Khalistani attacks. This was reported by the British media outlet The Times. It said India was angry because Britain had failed to crack down on the Khalistanis. Remember, India has come under attack in London. Khalistanis ran riot at the Indian High Commission last month. They tried to desecrate the Indian flag. New Delhi has been demanding action against them. It also identified the attackers and filed cases against them. Now, The Times has published this report. It says India will stall trade talks until London cracks the whip. Hours later, Indian authorities weighed in. They're said to have called this Times report baseless. No formal statement has been issued yet. The Indian denial was conveyed through an anonymous government source. And then a statement came from the UK, from a spokesperson of the Department for Business and Trade. This is what it said. Both the UK and India are committed to delivering an ambitious and mutually beneficial FTA, that's free trade agreement, and concluded the latest round of trade talks last month. So apparently the trade talks are on as scheduled. A British parliamentary delegation is also in New Delhi as we speak. This is to discuss trade and research opportunities. Also the free trade agreement or FTA. This is the first UK parliamentary visit to India in 6 years. Clearly, the trade deal is important. It's basically a UK-India free trade agreement or FTA. It's a way to facilitate trade between the two countries. And how do you do that? By reducing import tariffs. They'll also be able to sell each other goods and services in previously restricted sectors. The details are still being worked out. The FTA was proposed last year in June by the Boris Johnson government in London. And the UK has been very keen on it, especially after Brexit. Remember, they've had to leave the common European market, so they must secure bilateral trade deals to make up for it. The UK has approached Canada, Australia and India with new trade deals. And with India, they see a lot of promise. Even without a trade deal, bilateral trade between India and the UK was worth over $42 billion last year. It grew by $12 billion since 2021. It's a growth of over 40%. The FTA will raise it further. It is expected to boost trade by $35 billion annually by the year 2035. But the deal has been delayed, mostly because of the crisis in the UK government. Last year, remember, was chaotic for them. Two prime ministers got the boot in quick succession. First Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak began his innings trying to get the house in order. Trade talks only resumed after he met Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in November last year in Bali. This was during the G20 summit. So talks resumed then and have been making slow but steady progress. But last month, the Khalistani attack took place. India took a tough stance. It condemned the UK's lax approach to Indian security. It demanded that the Khalistanis be deported. And amid those tensions, trade talks got delayed. Since the attack, the UK has taken some steps to placate India. It has stepped up security outside the High Commission in London. It has also arrested the person who tried to desecrate the Indian flag and promised to not be lenient on violent Khalistanis. It can do a lot more, of course. Now, if the trade negotiations continue like usual, it means that New Delhi is taking London at its word. And it also points to a shift in the UK's approach to India. It's now a UK that listens to India's concerns and requests, one that doesn't disregard justified demands from New Delhi, a UK that goes out of its way to accommodate India. Is this a sign that India has arrived on the global stage? Well, yes and no. It's not as simple as that. The UK also needs the trade boost from India. It has been struggling economically since the Ukraine war began. And before that, due to Brexit. So once again, the UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. But the change is that India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. And now to what's being called the biggest breach since Edward Snowden. American intelligence has been compromised yet again. Hundreds of documents have been leaked. These are papers marked as top secret. They're about the war in Ukraine, about America's assessment of the conflict. They have maps, charts and photographs, and most importantly, they have American intelligence from both sides, Ukraine and Russia. This is classified information. It's the kind of stuff that is not shared with the public and not spoken about in press conferences. These are American national security secrets, and now they've been leaked. They're out on social media platforms. The biggest revelation is this: a U.S. assessment about the war in Ukraine. Washington is not confident about Ukraine's air defenses. It fears that Kiev could soon run out of missiles, and without immediate assistance, it could suffer serious setbacks. Now, you could say none of this is a secret, really. It's evident to anyone who's following the war. And you'd be right. But here's why this is significant. Publicly, the Americans say Ukraine is winning the war. Privately, they feel Ukraine is vulnerable. And this private assessment is now public. It's embarrassing for the US establishment. And it is damaging for Ukraine. Remember, in war, information is also a weapon. That is why it is so carefully guarded and managed. So this leak is definitely a loss. And we're not talking about one or two documents here. We're talking about almost 100 top secret documents. Almost 100 documents have been leaked. They appeared on internet platforms like Twitter, 4chan, and Telegram. It's not clear who leaked them, but the papers look photographed, as if someone took them out of a folder and clicked photos and then published them online. American officials are probing the source of the leak, and the papers reveal a lot. We'll cover the highlights tonight, starting with Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The leaked papers say that Ukraine is running out of supplies, specifically missiles for air defense. And this assessment dates back to February this year. So it's more than 2 months old, more than a month old, rather. It said that Ukraine is rapidly using up its stockpile, and by the 2nd of May, it could exhaust its air defenses. Now, let me repeat, this was the assessment in the month of February. We cannot say if it holds today or if Ukraine's stockpile is depleting at the same pace or faster or slower. But we do know that Kiev still depends on the West, and that Zelensky has repeatedly asked allies to speed up deliveries. So it is possible that Kiev would need more missiles, and that without them, it would be vulnerable. Russia will get an opening then to launch more aerial attacks. A Ukrainian colonel was asked about these leaks. He refused to comment on the specifics, but he did say that allies should speed up assistance. In fact, I had that statement with me. This is what he says: if we lose the battle for the skies, the consequences for Ukraine will be very serious. This is not the time to procrastinate. Clearly, the risk is real, and this is only one part of the leaked documents. What else do they say? They confirm what the world has long known, that America likes to spy both on allies and adversaries. These papers have revelations from Canada. This is about a Canadian gas pipeline. It was compromised by a Russian hacking group in February, and the US had an assessment about it. It said the hackers were being guided by Russia's FSB. FSB is the Russian Federal Security Service. It is the successor to the infamous spy agency KGB, of which President Putin was once a member. Meanwhile, the leaked papers also talk about Israel, about the recent protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial reform. You may remember those, the large-scale protests. They were arguably the biggest ever in Israel. Now, the Pentagon had a view on these protests. It says this was the work of Mossad. Mossad is Israel's spy agency. The Pentagon believes that Mossad backs the protest against Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that it encouraged its staff and Israeli citizens to participate in these protests. This is quite a dramatic claim. If proven, it could have serious consequences in Israel. For now, Israel has disputed it. The American papers also mention the possibility of Israel supplying weapons to Ukraine. It hasn't happened yet. Israel supplying weapons to Ukraine, but American officials have gamed out that scenario. South Korea too features in the leaks. Apparently, Seoul is torn between backing Ukraine and upholding its own policy. What policy? South Korea has a policy of not providing lethal weapons to a country at war. Now, the US believes they're debating this policy. And of course, Russia is a prominent feature in the American leaks. One of the documents says Russia is prepared to give a bonus to its troops. A bonus for what? For damaging or destroying a NATO tank in the battlefield. There's also an assessment on the Wagner Group. It says Wagner is working to thwart American interests in Africa. Wagner is a group of mercenaries. Again, none of this is a top secret, really. But the papers give you an insight into how America reads the current developments. Now, the question is, who leaked these documents? And why did they do it now? Did the Russians do it to embarrass the US? Did the Americans do it themselves to make a point? Was it Ukraine to force America's hand? Or a third party seeking to influence Washington's ties and moves? Honestly, we don't know. But the revelations could make allies think twice about sharing information with the US. Meanwhile, China is threatening Taiwan once again. Taiwan's president paid a visit to the US last week. She met US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The visit made Beijing furious. So for the past 3 days, the PLA, that's the Chinese army, has been doing drills around the island of Taiwan. These are reckless actions. They raise the threat of war. There's a military standoff. Ships from Taiwan and China came face to face. One wrong move could have triggered a war. This happened near the median line. The median line is the unofficial border between China and Taiwan. During the drills, Chinese ships came close to the median line. There were 20 ships in all, 10 of them from China, the remaining 10 from Taiwan. When the Chinese ships came close, Taiwan sounded an alarm. They asked the Chinese ships to return. The tense standoff was caught on camera. Take a look at this.
这里是中华民国海巡署100管沟艇广播。你现在已经严重破坏地域和平、稳定及安全，请你立刻转向驶离。如果你继续前进，我将采取驱离措施。
The PLA has been engaging in such activities for 3 days now. It has practiced how to encircle the island of Taiwan and how to block naval and aerial routes. The PLA simulated how to conduct targeted strikes on Taiwan. China's nuclear-capable H-6 bombers were in the air. They flew around Taiwan with live missiles, while warships made their presence felt in the waters. Beijing said these drills are a serious warning for Taipei.
外交部发言人此前已就蔡英文过境窜美发表。
As I have also introduced earlier, the spokesperson of the Eastern Theatre Command Military Division also pointed out recently that the Combat Police Patrol and the joint exercises around the island of Taiwan are a serious warning against the provocations of Taiwan independence separatist forces.
战备警巡和联合利剑演习。
Taiwan has released some numbers. As of this morning, they had spotted 59 military aircraft and 11 ships around Taiwan. China has been conducting training exercises on all sides. It is targeting the island of Taiwan from all directions. In response, Taipei launched its own military drills. Taiwanese planes and ships were dispatched to keep an eye on China. Like I said, the situation is quite dangerous. The United States has called for restraint, but the plea went unheeded. Last week, Xi Jinping clearly said that he will not climb down. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen was in Beijing. She asked the Chinese president to dial down the tensions. He snubbed her. He said it was quote-unquote wishful thinking to expect a compromise from Beijing. So forget backing down. He's doubling down on Taiwan. And at home, he's declared a war on China's financial sector. There is a wave of new corruption probes and surprise audits in China. Since February, more than a dozen executives have faced action. They've either been investigated or penalized over claims of corruption. The most high-profile case is that of Liu Liange. He's the former chairman of the Bank of China. The charges against him are not clear. The Communist Party has issued a one-line statement. It says, Liu is suspected of, and I'm quoting, suspected of serious violations of discipline and law. That's all that China bothers to say when it goes after a senior official. Serious violations of discipline. Ostensibly, it's a fight against corruption. But more often than not, it's a purge. They're eliminating the critics of President Xi Jinping. He took control in 2012, and since then, Xi Jinping has targeted more than 4 million officials, all in the name of fighting corruption. Most of these are government officials. And now China's financial sector is the new target. The crackdown has already begun, and they're feeling the heat. Banks are cutting salaries of executives, bonuses are being slashed, and this could get ugly in the coming days. Remember, last month, Xi Jinping began his third term in office. He has made himself more powerful in the Chinese system by installing loyalists in key positions. Now, President Xi is wielding this power against Taiwan and against his own people. Now, let's talk about something else that China seems to be disrupting: the US-Europe bonhomie. French President Emmanuel Macron was in China over the past few days. He held talks with China's Xi Jinping. He discussed the war in Ukraine and the tensions over Taiwan. But it was also a business trip, a way to get China to sign more trade agreements with France. And what was the outcome of the trip? Not too many tangibles. China refused to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. It refused to make any assurances regarding Taiwan. In fact, as soon as Macron was out of the Chinese airspace, China began its latest round of drills around the island. But both Macron and the Chinese media are hailing the trip as a huge success. Why? Because both sides believe it was a shot in the arm for European strategic autonomy. First, let's understand what that is. What is European strategic autonomy? It means that the European Union is acting independently of the US when it suits European interests. It means the EU not following America's lead in all conflicts and behaving like an independent global power. The question is, can Europe afford to do that? Also, why is Macron championing this cause? Because he doesn't want to fight with China. Remember, the US has promised to defend Taiwan if China attacks, and China has promised to take Taiwan by force if needed. Now, Emmanuel Macron says Europe should not get caught up with this. Washington has labeled Beijing as its greatest threat. It is fighting trade wars with China. And all of this affects Europe too. If European companies do certain businesses with Beijing, they face American sanctions. And this also limits Europe-China trade prospects. The French president wants to change all of that. So does German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He went to China last November to discuss trade. But it's a tough balancing act. Europe depends on the US for military protection which seems imperative considering what's going on in Ukraine. So it can't really afford to anger Washington beyond a point. But Emmanuel Macron says the EU should not follow the US policy everywhere, that European nations should not become American vassals, because they will suffer in the event of a US-China conflict. It's typical Europe. Remember, China overtook the US as Europe's largest trading partner in 2020. We mentioned this last week too. Now, Europe is suffering a cost of living crisis, mostly because of the war in Ukraine. And China's help will be essential in getting European economies back on track. So Europe is not very keen on this whole talk of decoupling with Beijing. They are more keen on what Macron is advocating. Ignore the US and keep dealing with China. It's like having your cake and eating it too. Just under the fancy label of European strategic autonomy. Now, of course, China wants all of this to happen as well. Trade with Europe would continue to boost China's economy. It also drives a wedge between America and its traditional European allies. It's a win-win for Beijing, really. And that could explain why China rolled out the red carpet for Macron over the weekend. He was invited to tea ceremonies. He was speaking at schools and basically swarmed by a fawning Chinese audience, like a French emperor visiting the grand Chinese court. And Macron wants the world to lap it all up. This is what he put up on his Twitter handle today.
Alors, oui.
Nous avons aujourd'hui à œuvrer pour éviter toute escalade et tout à la fois préserver et réinventer un ordre international de paix et de stabilité.
It's a stark contrast from his current predicament at home. For months, French people have been protesting. They've been protesting Macron's pension reforms. He has rammed through a law that raises France's retirement age from 62 to 64. The people are not happy about this. Violent clashes keep erupting between the police and the protesters. Strikes in every sector of the economy. Garbage being lined up across Paris. Could this trip to China have been a way for Macron to appear like a global statesman? Is that why he's championing European strategic autonomy as a way to avoid his domestic embarrassments? Macron's China trip makes him seem more grandiose than what his political realities suggest. But will the world really buy it? Whatever the French president's motives, China seems happy. And the US will have to start keeping an eye on its allies in Paris. Now we have some tragic news from Nigeria. The daylight massacres continue there. Last week was a particularly bloody one. Close to 75 people were killed in 2 separate attacks. Meanwhile, 80 others have been kidnapped, mostly children and women. Entire families have been destroyed. Nigeria's government has no plan, it seems, to control these mass killings. Tonight, we'll talk about the broken law and order system in this country. Why have killings and abductions become the norm? Also, what are the factors fueling this fire in Nigeria? Here's a report.
This is Nigeria on the western coast of Africa. And this is Nigeria's Benue state. Last week, at least 74 people were killed in the state. By whom? Gunmen. There were 2 separate attacks in the state last week. The first was on Wednesday in the remote Umogidi village. Here, herdsmen are suspected to have killed villagers at a funeral. Authorities say 46 bodies were recovered after Wednesday's attack. The second attack came on Friday. Eyewitnesses say gunmen arrived at a camp for internally displaced people and started shooting indiscriminately. At least 28 people were killed in this attack alone. And in Nigeria's Zamfara state, 80 people have been kidnapped. They're mostly women and children, abducted by armed gunmen. Zamfara is a hotspot for kidnappings. And last month, jihadists killed 37 fishermen in northeast Nigeria's Borno state. These are just incidents which got reported. Most of the violence that goes on in Nigeria fails to even make it to the news cycle. So the situation on the ground is much more perilous. There's a reason why violence is spiraling in Nigeria. The population is growing, and a growing population means the agricultural needs of the country are rising. There's more area available for farmers, while the land available for herders to graze their cattle is shrinking. They clash regularly, and it results in daylight massacres. The situation is especially worse in Nigeria's middle belt states like Benue. Here, fault lines between farmers and herders overlap with ethnic and communal tensions. This is a region where the Muslim majority north meets the Christian majority south. So there's a lot of social friction. The state of Benue, where over 70 people were killed last week alone, is a particularly sensitive one. It's one of the states hardest hit by violence between herders and farmers. Here are some staggering numbers. Between 2011 and 2016, communal land conflicts claimed at least 2,000 lives every year in Nigeria's middle belt alone. That's at least 10,000 lives lost in just 5 years. These daylight killings are rising because there seems to be no fear of the law. Nigeria is battling a 14-year-long jihadist movement in the country's northwest. In the southeast, separatist forces keep mounting their own attacks. And then there's the Middle Belt region, where communal violence poses a significant challenge. Here, heavily armed bandits ransack entire villages and kill people with impunity. They also carry out mass abductions to earn ransom money. So what's the government doing? Whatever it is, it's evidently not enough.
Our next story is from Turkey. The country is bracing for an election next month and a potential new entry is making waves. A famous footballer could be joining President Erdogan's party. We're talking about Mesut Ozil. He was the attacking midfielder who helped Germany win the FIFA World Cup in 2014. He played for Germany, but his origin is Turkish, and now he seems to be returning to his roots. Last week, he announced his retirement from football. He's putting his sports career behind him. But Mesut Ozil is just 34 years old. If he doesn't play football anymore, what will he do? Reports say he may be entering politics, and he may contest the election next month alongside President Erdogan. Now, some of you may already know this. Erdogan was a footballer himself. As a young man, he played semi-professional football at a local club, and that was a long time ago. Since then, Erdogan went on to become the mayor of Istanbul, then prime minister, and finally the president of Turkey. He's been at the helm for 20 years, which is a fairly long time in any profession, especially in the cutthroat world of politics. He's facing a tough election ahead. Anti-incumbency is catching up, the economy is in a shambles, and the recent earthquakes have shaken his support base. So he needed something new to pull voters. His party needed what is called a wow factor, and perhaps star footballer Mesut Ozil fits that bill. His entry has not been officially confirmed, but reports say his name is on the list of candidates in Turkey. These are the candidates who will contest elections from Erdogan's AKP party. Remember, it's not just a presidential election. Voters in Turkey will also be choosing the new parliamentarians. And Ozil is expected to run for parliament from a place called Zonguldak. It's his hometown in northern Turkey. And President Erdogan has been dropping hints about this recently. He said that there would be, quote-unquote, surprising names in the list, including that of a spokesperson. The local media have connected the dots, and they believe that Mesut Ozil is that surprise entry. The man is not alien to the world of politics. He has openly taken up issues that he feels strongly about. Recently, Ozil called on his Twitter followers to show solidarity with Palestine. He posted a photo of himself wearing a t-shirt that said, "Freedom for Palestine." Ozil is also an outspoken critic of China, particularly its treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the province of Xinjiang. His views have landed him in trouble in the past. From 2013 to 2021, Mesut Ozil played for Arsenal. He was among the club's most important players, also considered one of the finest in Europe. But Arsenal sidelined him, or is said to have sidelined him, because of his political positioning. Interestingly, he shares Erdogan's views on a lot of issues. They're believed to be close friends, although decades apart in age. Mesut Ozil has openly acknowledged his close relationship with President Erdogan. In 2019, Erdogan was the best man at Ozil's wedding. And now, when he faces the toughest election of his career, Ozil could be joining ranks with him. The opposition has united against the president. 6 parties have joined hands with the main opposition party in Turkey. In a survey last month, more than 44% of the respondents said they would vote for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And who is Kılıçdaroğlu? He's Erdogan's biggest challenger in this election. In a direct contest with Kılıçdaroğlu, Erdogan is trailing by more than 2 points. As things stand, Turkey's presidential election will probably head to a second round. That happens when neither candidate is able to secure 50% of the vote. This is where Erdogan stands. He needs fresh blood in his campaign. He needs the support of the youth, which explains Mesut Ozil's possible entry. But the political arena is very different from the football field. Can the star player score a goal for Erdogan? We'll have to wait and see. The year is 2018. It's just another Tuesday for most of us, but Elon Musk has launched the world's most powerful active rocket, catapulted a car into space, and vertically landed 2 rocket boosters simultaneously. This could have been the pinnacle of an entrepreneur's career, but Musk did not stop. He's now the world's second richest man. He runs the futuristic electric car company Tesla and the social media giant Twitter. He's also plotting a super-fast underground system, launching advanced spacecraft, offering help in international emergencies, and selling flamethrowers. But this is not without his many battles. He has now catapulted his companies into complete chaos, and he's making people angry. Most recently, he labelled Western media, the BBC and NPR, as government-funded. This riled them up. He also wants to build Tesla's batteries in Shanghai. Washington is not going to be happy with either. And these are just some of his oddities. He's known for this impulsive decision-making. So we ask, is Musk a superhero? Or as some reports say, just a boy's idea of a rich man? Here's more.
Elon Musk has put himself in charge of global free speech. He wants to change the world one Twitter handle at a time. He's aiming for maximum transparency on Twitter and trying to make media organizations self-aware, or so he says. Now he's highlighting links to ownership and source of funds. Twitter handles of organizations like the BBC and NPR are now marked with the label government-funded media, and they are not pleased. The BBC is saying that it is and always has been independent, adding that it's funded by the British public through a license fee. Britons pay about $196 each year to fund the BBC. This fee is set by the government. Meanwhile, America's National Public Radio says it will stop tweeting from this account unless it is freed of the label, saying it only receives some money from public institutions. Whether Musk is right or wrong, his decision has certainly angered many. And speaking of anger, another case comes to mind. Tesla is now expanding in China. It's building a new factory to make its large-scale batteries. We can only imagine that Washington won't be too pleased. The US government has been urging American companies to become less reliant on China. There are growing tensions between the two. US President Joe Biden fears America is losing its technological edge to China. But Musk doesn't seem to care too much. He wants to transform the world's energy system. And lately, it seems like Musk wants to transform everything. But is he really changing the world for good, or just creating play toys? Most of the battles Musk picks revolve around fast cars, smart toys, spaceships, dog memes, women, strange jokes, loving fans, and more memes. But the reality of how he's doing is a little different. Twitter is now valued at less than half of what he bought it for. Tesla stocks tanked after his Twitter purchase. His employees have been quitting back front and center. Some are being fired in the most inconsiderate ways. It seems like Musk has failed to admit when he is wrong. He refuses to apologize, and he rarely holds himself accountable. In December, he posted a Twitter poll asking if he should step down as CEO, saying he will do as the results say. 57% of the respondents said that he should. But guess who's still the CEO of Twitter? It's truly beginning to seem like with every dollar Musk makes, he acquires the ability to purchase carelessness.
In West Asia, the sands continue to shift, and the forgotten war is back in focus. We're talking about Yemen, the poorest country in West Asia, with a population of more than 30 million. It has been at war for over 9 years. It's a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it has ravaged the country. A record number of civilians have been killed, tens of thousands have been injured, and more people than ever are going hungry. 80% of Yemenis now depend on humanitarian aid. Yemen is a small West Asian nation and a site of grievous suffering. This desert nation on the edge of the Arabian Peninsula shares its borders with Saudi Arabia and Oman. And its neighbors, along with other countries, have literally backed it into a corner. We are talking about Yemen's forgotten war. It has been the country's undoing. At least 14% of its population have been displaced. Thousands killed, 70% of them are children. And most Yemenis are going hungry.
We were playing when a shell was fired from there. It hit us. I found myself in the hospital the next day. I tried to reach for my leg, but my father told me I was injured and I lost it.
There are a few organizations that hand out a ration of wheat every 3 months. It's handed out to some families only. Some organizations do not include this area in their aid handouts at all. The residential part of the city is in the line of fire and no aid has entered for a while.
With the lack of support provided to Yemen, the crisis will grow bigger and people's needs will multiply.
Yemen has been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But now there may be a ray of hope. A hope for ceasefire and a potentially permanent one. But first, let's quickly understand the conflict. Yemen's civil war began in 2014. It was started by Houthi insurgents. These are Shiite rebels with links to Iran and a history of rising up against Yemen's Sunni government. They took control of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. They toppled Yemen's Saudi-backed government in 2014. This invited intervention from foreign powers like Saudi Arabia. They economically isolated Yemen and launched violence against it. Even so, now Houthis control northern Yemen, and they've been fighting a Saudi-led military alliance since 2015. Yemen continues to pay the price of this proxy war. But now Saudi Arabia wants to talk peace. In fact, talks are on between Riyadh and Sana'a, and the neighboring kingdom of Oman is mediating. Saudi and Omani delegations landed in Sana'a late on Saturday.
We are continuing and making these efforts in the context of achieving just peace. First, we affirm our firm position adhering to our just cause in more than a speech and stance. Our just demands include stopping the aggression completely.
Their commitments have not been made public yet, but reports say they're looking at lifting a Saudi-led blockade on Yemeni ports. They want to fully reopen the Sana'a airport. And remember, Yemen has been working towards lasting peace for some time now. But this is the closest it has gotten to any real progress since the war began. International efforts are also making progress, like the United Nations peace efforts. They've been going on parallelly. They resulted in a temporary ceasefire last year. It was a period of truce. It enabled confidence-building measures, and restrictions on imports were eased. Prisoner exchange programs were held. But the real momentum came when Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to re-establish ties last month.
At the end of the talks, we reached a conclusion to start a new chapter after 7 years of breaking off relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia. While considering the matters of the two countries and the security and future of the region, to prevent meddling from extra-regional and Western states and consistent meddling of the Zionist regime in the region.
Saudi and Iran are behind this proxy war in Yemen. So if they take a step towards peace, the impact will be felt in Yemen too.
I would expect to see, or I would certainly track any developments in Yemen for the next weeks and months to see if this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran has any impact on the ground in Yemen, where I think all parties, at least the Saudis and the Iranians, both probably want to move on.
For a number of years, they have very much been in direct conflict as well as indirect conflict in other parts of the Middle East. And anything that can be done to reduce the kinds of violence that we see in Yemen, in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, between Iran and Saudi Arabia directly is of benefit not just to the people in the region, but also to the world.
Experts say that battle fatigue is clear among all parties. It seems like a war with no end and no fruits either. Can the peace talks, on top of everything else, help Yemen? There is no right answer yet. They can definitely make a dent, but it won't be easy. The political landscape in Yemen is complex. Negotiations could be drawn out. It could be extremely difficult to settle the differences. And Houthis remain the major force here. But they're talking to Saudis in the absence of other parties, including the Al-Qaeda. So while the détente between Saudis and Iran has helped, peace for Yemen will be a different ballgame. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Ukraine. Russia forces attacked a residential building in the city of Zaporizhia. 2 people have been killed. In Indonesia, a giant sperm whale died after washing up on a beach. This is the 3rd such incident in Bali in a week. Meanwhile, a town in Finland held a reindeer racing championship. In the US, divers and snorkelers participated in a fun Easter egg hunt. And finally, we're taking you back in history, what happened on the 10th of April. Titanic started its journey from England. The year was 1912. Titanic was the world's largest and most luxurious passenger ship of the time. It was traveling to New York. Its builders said the ship was unsinkable. The so-called technological marvel could not survive an iceberg. We all know how it ended. It sank, and so did the aspirations of voyagers and the overconfidence of the builders. More than 1,500 people, in fact, died. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Освободить, да. keltaisella värillä tullaan vahva. Nyt se on mennyt jo aikoja sitten. 10 aluksi pystyi tuoda keulapaikkaa puolustamaan. Sen sijaan punaisena tulee ykkösenä kulkuri. Nyt se on mennyt jo aikoja sitten. 10 sekuntia. Kämäläinen ykkönen. Lähelle tulee, todella lähelle, erittäin lähelle, ei aivan riitä. Aivalusta loiskasta tuo loppusuora.